Thank you so much, and I know that we are running out of time, and this session will be very strict in time management, so please don't be mad at me when I cut you on the discussions. So let's first put the context to our session now. As you all know, the world is confronted with multiple crises and unforeseen challenges. A growing state of uncertainty has come to dominate the global landscape. The capacities of national governments, as well as regional and global frameworks to deal with the rapid changes and continuous disruptions, are put to test. At the same time, crises can become pivotal moments for bold leadership, innovative policies, and forward-looking strategies that would shape future pathways. The foundations of future growth are often laid as nations and societies respond to the vulnerabilities and crisis exposure. In times of disruption, resilience depends on adaptability and determination. Today's risks often cut across borders, and no countries seem immune of them. Accordingly, there is a pressing need for an inclusive collective action in the face of collective problems, with emphasis on enhanced cooperation in pursuit of shared objectives. In this context, this session will instigate a strategic dialogue for future action on peace, security, climate, and sustainable development, as well as to identify forward-looking approaches for advancing collective action, bearing in mind key opportunities to achieve this, including in COP27 and the UN Summit for Future in 2023 and among other milestones. So, without taking further time, I would like to start with our first speaker, who will be joining us virtually, Ms. Christina Durati. She is the Special Advisor on Africa to the United Nations Secretary General. Madame Durati, last year the UNSG published our Common Agenda report, which outlines a vision for the future of global cooperation founded on a more inclusive, networked, and effective multilateralism. In the report, the Secretary General has also proposed a 2023 Summit of the Future to forge a new global consensus on the agenda for peace and security and the way forward. However, the escalating global crises and the contemporary security challenges have posed questions to the role of multilateral cooperation. So, at a time when multilateralism is under severe pressure, how can the Summit of the Future revitalize international cooperation? And how do we ensure that African voices are presented and that no vulnerable region or societies are left behind? The floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning from New York, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Allow me to greet in special my dear friend, Mahmoud. So, Mahmoud, it's a pleasure to see you again in this workshop. All protocols observed. I have been told that I have 7 minutes, so I prepared an intervention for 7 minutes, and I will stick to time. I will try to stick to time. Allow me to start with some quotes from the Secretary General. Multilateralism is failing its most basic test. It was referring to the COVID-19. So, no multilateral system to face the challenge that our moderator just mentioned in his introductory remarks. Second quote from the Secretary General. Our world needs more and better multilateralism based on deeper solidarity to deal with the crisis we face and to reverse today's dangerous trends. End of quote. So we have a challenge to build a better multilateralism. Let's say a version 2.0. I believe that it's crucial to bear in mind the relationship between globalization and multilateralism, because these are the two faces of the same coin. And to better understand the relationship between globalization and multilateralism, so we contextualize better the Summit of the Future, allow me to recall 3 main features of the globalization. First, after the industrial, and I'll be very brief, after the Industrial Revolution, globalization was an unavoidable historical outcome because it reflects the essence of the system, a survival and permanent need for increased economic space. So the expression, Africa is the last frontier, is related to this notion. Second, poverty alleviation is not in the globalization's DNA. Poverty alleviation is a byproduct of globalization. result from the permanent need, as I mentioned, of the systems for economic space to invest, to sell, to realize the profits, to accumulate, and to invest again. And this is a reason why, at the same time, billions of people gain from globalization, but much more has been left behind. Third, the reason that billions have been left behind is because, by its nature, globalization does not produce check and balances, which means leaving it completely free. Globalization is a permanent mechanism of producing imbalances. Fourth, these notions are important to understand the relationship between globalization and multilateralism, the multilateralism that we need to rebuild to face the challenge that the moderator just made. So, globalization needs international policy-making mechanisms to deliver mainly on two functions. The first function is to pave the way function, and the second function to take care of the imbalances function, as I used to call. What imbalances the multilateralism is supposed to take care? Poverty, inequality, inclusion, income distribution, you name it. So regarding the first function, the pave the way function, multilateralism has worked very well through essentially the IMF, World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. So the adoption of massive liberal policies have resulted in the build of well-structured and strong global value chains. In fact, in 2018, trade was 58% of the world GDP, and about 70% of international trade today involves global value chains. Regarding the second function that globalization needs from the multilateral system, what I call the take care of the imbalance function, things have not worked so well. In fact, the social contract has been broken. Allow me to quote again the Secretary General. Multilateralism is failing its most basic test. Allow me to just mention a couple of reasons, in my view. The first, international regulatory debt has provided vested interests with an opportunity to consolidate their advantage. Second, lack of global collective political leadership, which has resulted in a failure to empower the principal multilateral bodies and made them accountable. Millions of people below poverty line. In the international policy-making arena, who is accountable? Nobody. Third, the fact that multilateral organizations have been held hostage by inflexible and inefficient decision-making process. So, without global collective political leadership and with inflexible, let's say, process or decision-making process, reaching political consensus has become more difficult. This is the reason that the Secretary General has made a strong call in our common agenda to build trust, an important intangible asset. So the lack of trust signals a mismatch between the World War II multilateralism model and the emergency of a new international economic order. As we all know, multilateralism does not create international economic orders. Economic orders emerge from historical correlation of forces process. Multilateralism manages them. So, and suddenly the UN system is just in the middle of this hurricane. So there is a strong need to rescue the second function of the multilateralism, the function that takes care of the imbalances that are produced or naturally produced by globalization. And I believe the climate energy debate, COP27, so related to climate energy, is maybe one of the best examples. Climate change is a global phenomenon. African countries tend to lose more than the rest of the world. So the narrative that climate change is a global phenomenon cannot dilute its accountability. So therefore, to have a clear mutual accountability framework regarding climate energy is a critical piece to collectively succeed in this endeavor. This should be the starting mindset. Only under a clear mutual and global accountability framework produced by a restructured, revamped multilateral system, which, as we know, is missing Africa's challenges, Africa's specificities, can be factually 600 million without electricity, 8 million jobs to be generated annually, commodity export dependence, digitalization, you name it. So in this regard, I would like to underscore that Africa cannot adapt to a changing climate without access to reliable, affordable, and sufficient energy. So African countries, most of whom have a long way to go before achieving energy access for their populations, are being asked to walk a delicate balance to meet global climate commitments with an increasingly limited financing and menu of energy generation options. So one of the central recommendations of our common agenda is that the world should come together to consider all these issues and more at a high-level summit of the future. This summit will aim to forge a new global consensus on what our future should look like and how we can secure it. The summit will include a new agenda for peace that takes a more comprehensive, holistic view of global security. So the Secretary General calls for an intergovernmental body that thinks beyond immediate geopolitical dynamics to consider the interests of our entire human family, present and future, and calls for measures to rebuild trust and social cohesion through a renewed social contract anchored in human rights. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Durati, for laying out the vision of the Secretary General. And also, I would like always to capture some of the elements that you have mentioned. One of them is that poverty alleviation is not in the DNA of globalization, and there is a need for a version 2.0 of the multilateralism, and accountability and responsibility are issues that needs to be taken forward and have to be part of any regime and any system that we are creating or we are implementing, including, of course, the climate one. Having said that, I will just move to our next speaker, Mr. Benedict Frank. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Munich Security Conference. Of course, Munich Security Conference, as one of the leading global platforms, it has discussed in its 58th session a wide range of global security issues and challenges, many of which resonate with the themes put forth at the third edition of the Aswan Forum. And this year's Munich Security Conference theme was Unlearning Helplessness, manifesting the collective feeling of helplessness in the face of what has been described as a rising tide of mutually reinforcing crises, ranging from the pandemic to climate change, vulnerabilities in an interdependent world, geopolitical rivalries, and all the way to humanitarian crisis and violent conflicts and beyond. So at a time of imperative need for innovative solutions to respond to global challenges, how do you, Benedict, envision the role of the global and regional focused platforms like the Munich Security Conference and the Aswan Forum in advancing global cooperation? And how can we draw synergies across these various platforms to foster global actions? And how do we move beyond the collective helplessness to collective action in pursuit of shared objectives and to respond to the tide of crisis? I know those are 4 questions, but still stay 7 minutes. So we are in your hands. Benedict, you have the floor.
First of all, thank you so much, Mohammed, for having me here. We at the Munich Security Conference, we treasure our friendship with the Aswan Forum, and we treasure our friendship with Egypt. Second of all, thank you to you all for still being here. I know it's been a packed day, and things have run a little longer than we thought. But you're the real thing. You're the committed ones. And so I'll do you a favor. I won't speak for 7 minutes. I won't even speak for 5 minutes. I'll do it in 4. I was trying to beat Ambassador Losa, who gave the shortest but best speech ever last night at the dinner. I probably won't be quite as short, but I'll try to do 2 things. First of all, to quickly explain to you what we mean with unlearning helplessness, and then try to give you an idea how fora like the Aswan Forum or the Munich Security Conference can help all of us unlearn helplessness. So what is helplessness all about? Just ahead of the last Munich Security Conference, we were in a situation that most of you that organize events have probably been in before. We didn't really know what our theme should be because there were so many themes out there that we couldn't find the one that described them all. And so what we did is we did a global survey. We went to virtually every country in the world and we asked 1,000 people per country to rank their worries, to let us know what their biggest worries in the field of peace and security are. And you know what we found out, and it's actually not that surprising, is that people are so overwhelmed with crises these days that they fail to be able to rank them in any logical order. Remember the time that I'm talking about is January of this year. The pandemic was still raging through Europe. The Russian invasion was sort of at the edges of our perception. Europe was still mostly worried about China. We had climate change to worry. But there are all these things, and they sort of added up to a wave, a tidal wave of crises that people felt helpless in the face of. They felt helpless individually, that they couldn't change anything, but they also felt that collectively, that their governments weren't able to effect positive change. And so what we believe is the central role of fora like the Munich Security Conference, but also our newest sister, the Aswan Forum, is to make the case that we're not helpless and to showcase examples and success stories. We've just heard from Eduardo the story about chickpeas in Kenya. There are so many fantastic success stories out there, and we need to showcase them. Let me just tell you a little about helplessness. When we looked at this idea of helplessness, we quickly came across the psychological theory of learned helplessness. And I'm not sure whether you've ever heard of it. We certainly haven't. But it's a very interesting theory to describe the situation that parts of our world are currently in. There is an experiment that if you lock a dog in a room and you show him food, and every time, just before the dog touches the food with his nose, you take it away. After about 3 or 4 days, the dog will stop trying because he gives up hope that he can effect positive change, that he can do something that matters. And there is a strong argument that parts of our global governance mechanism, that parts of our national governance structures have presented to the public or are perceived by the public to have lost this will to generate positive change. And I believe that, you know, in addition to all the things that the Munich Security Conference, that an Aswan Forum can do, like showcase success stories, like invite the next generation to speak, invite voices that are underrepresented or ignored or left out. In addition to all these, what we really need to do is to prove that collective action actually does work. And you know what the dangerous thing is that in our bubble, in our silo, we all hear success stories every day and we believe in them. But big parts of our populations, of our societies, don't hear such success stories. They do not know what is possible. And so we at the Munich Security Conference will work very hard to leave our elite focus of the last 60 years and try to make a contribution by showcasing success stories. So let me end, hopefully within my 4-minute frame, by calling upon all of you to share success stories with us, with the Aswan Forum and similar organizations, so that we can play our part to help you and help us all. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Benedict, for staying within the 4 minutes, beyond 4 minutes, but it was excellent. And 2 points just to share with you. I mean, the vision that you put forward is our vision as COP presidency. We want to bring forward success stories, and that's why we said implementation in COP27, success stories that could be replicated and scaled up. So I think we are on the same wavelength. We hope that people come with success stories in COP27, and they also are assured that things are happening, and that this collective will to to ensure that multilateralism is delivering will be manifested in the outcomes of COP27. I'm keeping my fingers crossed, and we hope that we see this at the end of the COP. So thank you so much. Next on my list on the speakers is Mr. Dan Smith, who is joining us virtually. He's the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The Stockholm Institute has recently launched a timely report titled Environment of Peace, Security in a New Era of Risk. The report offers policymakers principles and a series of recommendations for navigating this volatile future the world is confronted with, including addressing the linked crises with joint solutions, investing in preparedness and resilience, and delivering a just and peaceful transition. Mr. Dan, as a director of CIPRI and co-author of the report, how do you generally envision putting those three particular recommendations into action? And how we ensure just and peaceful transitions, and where such transitions measured do not create increased risks of conflict in the vulnerable regions? Again, I will remind you, it's 5 to 7 minutes intervention. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers of the Aswan Forum, with which CIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is a partner for both for our Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development held a few weeks ago, and for helping with the Aswan Forum itself. I'm very pleased to be joining you. Sorry it has to be virtual, but I'm in Seoul in South Korea at the moment, and I'm 7 time zones ahead of you at the moment. So if you think you're running late, have pity on me. What our report does is produce a mountain of evidence about the interlinkages between the environmental issues and the peace and security issues. We show ways in which environmental deterioration, especially climate change, feeds into social and political instability in a way that sometimes cannot be handled, and to which the only sort of way out, the only response is violent conflict. We also see ways in which conflict makes it hard to handle the environmental issues, so that environmental problems go unaddressed on the local scale. But also, of course, we see this on the global scale as well. Climate change, like other problems, like pandemic prevention and other aspects of the environmental crisis, really can only be addressed through cooperation. And we have a rising need for cooperation these days, and a declining appetite for it. So how can we address this? Well, let me sum up our findings by saying that environment and peace are so inextricably and closely interlinked that if you damage one, you damage the other. But the good news is that the linkage works both ways. So if you enhance one, you enhance the other. And that is the starting point of, I think, what is actually a quite optimistic sections of the report about what to do about this. And that is working on the problems which are linked, working in a joined up way. We need to have better foresight to understand the risks. And that is a very manageable task to improve our foresight and analysis, especially on the basis of the research we've been doing. But in addition, we have to, governments have to, societies have to, the world has to grasp the nettle of making the transition away from fossil-dependent economies. The thing about this is that this is an enormous economic and social transformation. It is essential that it is made, but we must make it with our eyes open and understand that there are risks entailed, and that there, in such a transformation, there will be losers as well as winners. There will be people whose jobs and livelihood are at risk or even lost. There will be communities which will be destabilized by the change as the economic modes which they have been used to for decades become no longer viable. And we have to carry out the transition in such a way that we can see that it is fair, and because it is fair and just, therefore it can be peaceful. And the way in which that is possible, the way in which it is possible to have a just and a peaceful transition, is by making it one that includes and is responsive to all of the main stakeholders. And that includes, in particular, indigenous people and other marginalized groups, as well as thinking about different governments, the different levels of government, from not just national but the city, and also, of course, the private sector. We need at the same time to understand that the effects of climate change are going to endure for some decades, however wonderfully, imaginatively and quickly we act to initiate the green transition. And therefore we're going to need to continue to find ways to adapt to the impact of climate change so that the problems of insecurity are reduced. One starting point for this is that we really must begin to invest in resilience rather than in activities which damage the environment. It's not just the case, it's not only a problem that military expenditure last year passed the level globally of $2 trillion US. It's also that the world spends on subsidizing fossil fuels the extraordinary sum of $500 billion a year. And yet the donors find it hard to find the $100 billion pledged for adaptation. So the resources are there, they need to be used with care for everybody, in everybody's interests, for the present and the future, in a just and peaceful transition. And that's the finding of the evidence that we bring forward in this report, Environment of Peace. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this. And yes, I mean, the issue of justice, equity, peace, fair, and transition have always been part of the discussion when it comes to climate change. The challenge is always in the implementation side. So we'll see how things develop in the coming days and months, all the way to COP27 and beyond. So next on my list is Selwyn Hart, a very good friend. And he is the United Nations Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action. Climate change has been referred to as a defining issue of our time, posing challenges to international security and stability with potential far-reaching implications to the global peace and security landscape. In your capacity, Selwyn, as the UN Special Advisor and Assistant Secretary General for Climate Action, you are in the forefront of steering climate action efforts towards sustaining peace and development. So how does advancing the climate agenda today be impacted by the multiple and concurring crises? Taking into account the discussions iterated throughout the Aswan Forum, the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, and the Stockholm Plus 50. And how can we foster greater understanding and action around climate, peace, and security interlinkages? Selwyn, I will remind you it's 7 minutes, so please don't make me cut you off after 7 minutes. Selwyn, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Nasser Mohammed. Always a pleasure to see you, my friend. And I'm really sorry that I'm not there with you in Egypt, but hopefully we will see each other soon. It's certainly a pleasure for me to join you and other colleagues on really what is a very timely discussion on the intersection between climate, peace and security, sustainable development at a moment of immense and extremely complex global challenges. And quite frankly, if we lose the fight against the climate crisis, we will not be able to sustain the peace. We will not be able to achieve the sustainable development goals. And we will see an exacerbation, as we already see, between the global haves and the global have-nots, both within and between countries. So the world is, quite frankly, and the United Nations, we are at really a critical moment in human history where the choices that are made now will have severe implications, not only for this generation, but also future generations as well. So where are we in the fight against the climate crisis? Where are we? And I'll be very blunt. We're losing the fight. We are losing the fight against the climate crisis. That's the bad news. Global emissions are at their highest level, and they keep rising. Many of the choices that major economies currently are making in response to the war in Ukraine, quite frankly, have the potential to lock in a high-carbon, polluting future, place it out of reach permanently the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. The good news, though, is that the window of opportunity to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis, that window of opportunity is still open. We have less than a decade, way less than a decade, to change course. And a second bit of good news is that we have the tools, both technological and financial tools at our disposal to make the transitions that many of the colleagues have spoken about. However, these tools need to be deployed at scale and speed if we are to be effective in our battle against the climate crisis. On the mitigation front, renewables, renewables, renewables. That's the low hanging fruit. And the Secretary General has been explicitly clear, keeping the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement requires us to get out of coal and other fossil fuels as quickly as possible. And renewable energy, as we know, in most jurisdictions is cost competitive to coal and other fossil fuels. The cost of solar and battery storage has declined by 85% over the course of the last decade, and wind by 55%. We need at least $4 trillion a year in new investments in the energy sector to modernize grids and to invest in renewable, new and emerging renewable energy technologies, really to provide us with a fighting chance to keep the 1.5-degree goal of the Paris Agreement. We also need to ensure that developing countries, Africa and other developing countries, are not left behind in this renewable energy transition. Africa attracts a mere 2% of investment in renewable energy, despite having the best potential for renewable energy globally. And for developing countries in general, the cost of capital for renewable energy investments is sometimes 7 times higher than it is for the developed countries. We need to change the economics and financing around renewable energy access for the developing world. This is our best hope. We really need to help these countries. We need to help the developing world to capture the benefits of the renewable energy revolution. And this requires all of finance to be mobilized. The $100 billion goal, 13 years ago, Mohammed, you were there, when it was promised to the developing world, still not being delivered. And the multilateral development banks, as of last year, were mobilizing less than $1 of private finance for every dollar of MDB finance. This is not acceptable. If we are to mobilize public and private finance at scale so that we can make this transition in the developing world, the shareholders and the management of these institutions need to be a lot more creative and innovative to allow the developing countries to harness the benefits of a renewable energy future. I've also heard in some quarters that we need to make a choice between mitigation and adaptation. That's a false choice. We need to do both with urgency and ambition. It is the developing world that is on the front lines of the climate crisis. If you're living in Africa, if you're living in Central or South America, if you're living in South Asia or in a small island developing state, you're 15 times more likely to die from a climate impact. This is not acceptable. 6 out of every 10 persons living in Africa don't have access to an early warning system. And globally, 1 out of every 3 persons don't have access to early warning systems. And these persons are primarily the small island developing states and the least developed countries. The world needs to do a lot better. And this is why the Secretary General has called and has tasked the World Meteorological Organization to ensure that, to develop an action plan to ensure that over the course of the next 5 years, everyone has access to early warning systems. Finally, on the adaptation front, adaptation attracts a mere 25% of global climate finance. On a good year, usually it's around 20%, which is about $20 billion a year. And I just heard the numbers from Dan, where the fossil fuel industry is being supported, subsidized to pollute in the order of $500 billion a year. We need to do better for humanity on the adaptation front. And the Secretary General has been very clear. He's called for 50% of adaptation of climate finance to flow to adaptation. And we need to help Africa and other vulnerable countries and regions really to build the project pipelines that are desperately needed. And as we head towards COP27, we need movement on all fronts. We need movement to address the issues of loss and damage. And I know, Mohammed, you and the team in Egypt will ensure this, because we know that the impacts are worsening, and they're worsening in the developing world. So finally, my parting message is we need to accelerate action on all fronts. It is now or never. This is a do or die moment. Let us use these multiple crises really to accelerate the transition to a net zero climate resilient future, and this will carry benefits for the sustainable development goals and for international peace and security. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Selwyn, and thank you so much for bringing in those issues of finance adaptation and the need for renewable energy to really be the focus of in developing the energy moving forward globally, and specifically the special circumstances of Africa. And also thank you for the vote of confidence in the Egyptian presidency, trying to bring COP27 issues to agreement, including the loss and damage, which will be like a very important issue. Last point, and before giving my next speaker the floor, as you mentioned, there is a need for a transformation in the thinking and the financial institutions, transformation on definition of what is bankable and what are bankable projects. Without this transition in the thinking and transformation of the thinking on finance, I think things are still very difficult. So thank you again for bringing those issues. My next speaker is Mr. Fonti Akoum. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Security Studies. Mr. Fonti, the world is undergoing contemporary tensions and challenges where the African continent is especially impacted. From climate-related challenges, protected violence, and forced displacement, to an emerging food and energy crisis, Africa is yet to recover from the socio-economic repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in an era defined by transformative trends, rapid change, and cascading risks, what are the new and innovative partnership modalities needed for the African continent to achieve sustainable peace and development? The floor is yours, and again, the 7 minutes reminder.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the colleagues from CCC and the government of Egypt for organizing yet another wonderful ASWAN forum. The question about partnerships is key, but to set the scene, I would like to go back to the last 48 hours of discussions, which basically have evidenced 4 key points, although there could be about 100 that fill the room. The first key point is that financing modalities actually matter. The second point is that, like the preceding speaker just noted, Africa, most African countries would likely miss the Sustainable Development Goals targets by 2030, largely through the implications of COVID-19, but other conflict-related and climate shocks. The third issue that came up was the necessity not just to scale interventions, but to connect different scales of interventions to address issues around the continent. And finally, there is a silver lining. The target for the Africa we want by 2063 is still attainable if we go with urgent, concerted, and deliberate systematic action. What does that imply for partnerships? It has implications for the form, the function, and the expected outcome for partnerships that are meant to address peace and security and development as well on the continent. The first is that partnerships need to be lessons-based in order to prevent future risks. What we learned from COVID-19 as well as the conflict around the continent is that a lot of the risks that we face or the challenges we face are mutative, they're adaptable, and they evolve over time, taking different forms. They take a life of their own. Now, do our instruments we have in place actually evolve? Are they agile? Are they flexible enough to deal with these changing dynamics of threats that we face? I'm not sure what variant of COVID we are right now. We are not out of the woods, but unless we can adapt, unless our partnerships can adapt as well, we would always be coming behind the problem and then looking to cascading risks. The second issue that I would like to put on the table is the necessity to map out interventions and partnerships so as to avoid duplication. There are many ways in which the frameworks we have at the moment do duplicate one another. And you could look at an example of an organization or some organizations on the continent like the Lake Chad Basin Commission or the ILJ. These are organizations whose initial vocation might have been hydrology, but over the years, they have come to sit at the forefront of development and counterterrorism, where terrorist activities have prevailed. The third issue I would like to put on the table is one of getting partnerships and organizations that actually seek to leverage opportunities out of transitions. We heard about helplessness. I think we should also seek to leverage opportunities. And Africa is going through quite a number of transitions. The first one being a demographic transition. We have had the youth speak out here over the past couple of days. By 2040, about 23% of the population of this planet would be African. We are looking at 2.1 billion inhabitants. What kinds of partnerships would be able to leverage the opportunities from this growing youth population on the continent? The second transition we are looking at is the climate one. How do we leverage the opportunities for green developmental transitions that are also just on the continent and do not necessarily create other political economic tensions due to inadapted labor practices across the continent? We would need to address that. And partnerships as well that look to leverage the governance transitions on the continent. I know that reference has been made to unconstitutional changes of government, but rather than looking at them like reversals, they equally are opportunities to actually consolidate the continent's resolve around norms for democratic governance, accountability, and representation, because not one regional economic community or continental body, or the continental body itself, has endorsed any of the sort of coups and unconstitutional changes of government that have taken place so far, and the Malabo declarations that would be coming out certainly show the continent's resolve to entrench democratic governance as part of these processes. And a final opportunity rests with the issue of economic transitions. Africa sits at the cusp of contribution to the fourth industrial revolution. I think for many of us sitting out here, that would seem very far-fetched, but we have the demographics on our side, we have the mineral resources on our side, we have the land on our side, but we also have the possibility on the continent to leverage the transformative potential of our agriculture to transform not just primary commodities, but mineral commodities at the moment and drive that revolution. And that would definitely have implications for the very form of these partnerships that could contribute to peace, security, and development. And moderator, just 2 minutes to speak to the form. The first thing that has come out of the past 2 days of conversation has been inclusivity. What does inclusivity actually mean in practice? It's beyond just including youth and women and other marginalized communities. It means actually going back to the African Charter and the values and principles of decentralization, democracy, and good governance that points to the need for effective territoriality on the continent, because enhancing the continent's administrative capacity to exercise full territoriality is key to addressing many of the issues that we are facing at the moment. And there's the possibility to leverage the technological transitions to make this happen as well. And finally, we need partnerships that account for different outcome measures. Now, we have spoken about urgency, the urgency of now in developing frameworks to address these issues. But just like when you plant a tree, as we were talking about the climate as well, it takes time for this tree to grow. So the whole time horizons to see the fruits of these investments should also accommodate the expectations, not just of receiver communities, but also donor communities as well. I will yield the floor at this point, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Akoum, and I think, what you mentioned about the need for adaptive partnerships and avoid duplications and inclusivity, those are like keywords that I think we should take forward and really expand on, among, of course, the other very important elements. Next on my list is Mrs. Sarah Al-Batouti, who is the Global Ambassador to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. Sarah, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals reaffirm that growth and sustainable development cannot be achieved without addressing climate-related challenges and enhancing environmental sustainability. In doing so, it is imperative to not only include governments and civil society actors, but also the private sector as a critical player and key agent of change. So, Sarah, in your view, what are the modalities needed to stimulate the private sector engagement in climate adaptation and resilience? And how can the private sector contribute to strengthening resilience among local communities and youth? You have the 7 minutes.
Noted, thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'll get straight to 3 things. I think the most important thing to discuss first is gaps. And when we're talking about the private sector, there are very, very large gaps between policy and implementation. The private sector is here to implement, but at the end of the day, it's an agent for action. And this has to be utilized in the fight for climate change and climate action. When we're developing the policies, there has to be a conversation with how the private sector can mobilize the situation right now. And we see it because the private sector, for the longest time, has been on the receiving end of decisions to move forward. That's not capitalizing on the opportunities. It's not capitalizing on how much we can invest in the private sector as companies. So the first thing is there needs to be an increase in dialogue between the policymakers and those who are actually putting action on the floor. It's very important that this dialogue is enhanced in all of the sectors. In my sector, for instance, I'm talking about the field of green building and green construction. Today, it is becoming more and more apparent that the construction sector is lagging behind and is inactive. It's been fossil fuels and agriculture for a long time. These kind of indications as to these directions help the private sector to mobilize investment, to start working on R&D, which is very necessary. So that's the first thing. Keep the information, transparent, keep knowledge passing from policymakers into private sector and so on. The second thing is, I think we need to keep tabs on the technologies and the types of solutions that we put out there. And if we talk about smart technologies and technologies that solve a particular problem, we have to realize that these kinds of technologies need to be absorbed and need to be actually useful to the consumer that's using it. There are gaps in technologies that are not accessible or affordable for many parts of the world. And I'm talking about not just Africa, I'm talking about rural communities. I'm talking about specific income levels. We have to have an array of solutions that everyone can have access to, and everyone can scale up, everyone can scale out, and everyone can interpret. I'm also talking here about cultural relevance of technologies. This is very important to maintain as we talk about solutions, the upcoming themes for COP, and also, which brings me to the final point, the gap in gender in these solutions. 3% of CEOs working in tech are women. Within that 3%, there is less than half that are working on technologies that provide climate solutions. That isn't a representation of the group that requires the most climate solutions. So we need to have these gaps addressed. The first thing is we need to look at the education of women, their integration into green jobs and STEM, and then enabling them access to financing for this. If I have a man who is doing the same thing as another woman, the application most likely will go to the man and the financing will go to the man. This is the situation today. And I think we need to address this because there is very, very large imbalances in the market for employment, in the market for green jobs, and also in the absorption of the green technologies. I can't produce something and call it smart and successful if half of the population is not using it. So I think these are the three main takeaways that I would bring into the conversation, and it's very, very much based around localizing knowledge, making it accessible, and highlighting the success stories, and putting that in the context of development without adding the bracket of climate. It's just development.
Thank you so much, Sarah, first for keeping it for the time and also for bringing those issues of solutions and technology and gender, like the three main pillars that I think are also included in COP27, where we have a solutions day, will be run by you. So hopefully we'll be seeing like something substantive coming out of that, and also for highlighting the gap, the knowledge gap and the technology gap. So thank you again. This concludes the list of speakers that I have. So now the floor is open for any questions, if needed and as needed. We have 5 minutes. It seems that the panel was very informative, and I think everybody absorbed what was said. They enjoyed it, or they want to leave. I don't know, it's one of the two things. So, okay, then there is no questions. Let me ask you all to have a round of applause for the panel. That was really, really informative, and for me, as part of the COP presidency team, we'll be taking many of the elements that were put forward, be it from the virtual participation or from you. And just one point of apologies from Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen, who was supposed to be with us on the panel, but unfortunately he had an urgent commitment that he had to attend to, so he couldn't join us. So thank you again. Now I hand it back over to the Secretariat to see what, at least we'll have 5 minutes rest, right? Okay, so thank you, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the distinguished panelists.